The people were astonished at the Lord's preaching. They were astonished at the Lord's preaching. And it made me think about, what preaching has inspired me. And it makes me want to ask all of us, think about it. Who is a preacher who really inspired you? Who is a preacher who inspired you?
I've got a question for you.
Okay, go for it.
Who's a preacher that inspired you?
You see, he must have already known what I was going to say, because, a preacher who really inspired me in my life was Father Patrick Brennan. Oh, my heart would leap for joy when I knew he was going to be doing the Mass. In fact, we used to phone the church and find out when Father Patrick Brennan was doing the Mass. Of course, they'd never tell us, so it was like, gambling to see which Mass he was actually doing. But boy, my heart would just leap for joy when Father Patrick Brennan was doing the Mass.
Well, how did his preaching uplift you, Father Brennan?
All right, well, the reality is, his preaching was just real, and it was practical, and it spoke to the heart. And the thing is those who knew him best remembered him for his preaching. As we hear, he was an extraordinary preacher, said Monsignor Kenneth Velo, a friend since high school days. He was shy and private, but his preaching style was amazing in the way he connected human experience to spirituality. And another person said, he did his sermon and people were standing up and clapping. He touched your heart. Joanne Sila Easton said, those homilies just kept you going. A shy little Irish guy, but on the pulpit, he was transformed and he spoke out on many issues. Father Patrick Brennan, he touched my heart, and his homilies were practical.
Okay, all right. Sounds like a great guy, Father Brennan, right?
Yeah.
Well, what kind of preachers leave you feeling like flat, like...
The preachers that don't inspire me, that just leave me flat, are those that, they're basically more about the preacher. They're trying to show off by maybe entertaining you, or they're trying to impress me by their brilliance, how knowledgeable they are, and by all the research that they did. I knew this one priest, and he was brilliant, and I used to fall asleep during his homilies. In fact, after Mass one Sunday, he was so mad at me because I was snoring so loud during his homily, the whole church heard me. And I said to him, yeah, I was really angry at my snoring too, because I was snoring so loud it woke me up and you weren't done preaching yet. Because believe me, the most painless, quickest way to get through his preaching was to sleep through his preaching. So those are the ones that don't inspire me. It's all about them. It's very little to do with Jesus.
Well, what's the difference between inspiring preaching and uninspiring?
Okay, uninspiring is people when they're talking to me about Jesus like it's just hearsay. They're just like talking about Jesus. Just like it's hearsay. Oh, they heard something about him and they're talking about, the inspiring preachers, the one who's really inspire me, are those who introduce me to Jesus like they're introducing me to a close friend. They introduce me to Jesus like they're introducing me to a close friend.
Well, Jesus was no ordinary preacher, right? What do you think of that?
We heard very clearly in today's Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verses 21 to 22, that Jesus was more than an ordinary preacher. It says, on the Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue and taught. The people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. That's the type of preacher Jesus was. They were astonished.
What do you think the power behind that was in his preaching?
Well, see, I don't think Jesus just talked about God. Just because I don't think he just talked about God. He preached from a relationship with his Father. It was like he was sharing his relationship with God. It wasn't just about God, but it was from his relationship with God. And what I love about it is he invites all of us to enter into that same type of relationship with God. We hear in the Gospel of John, chapter 17, verse 21, Jesus says, I pray that all will be one, just as you and I are one, as you are in me, Father, and I am in you. He spoke from his relationship with his Father. It came from his heart. And he invites us to enter into that same relationship, to have the Lord in our hearts. And so that's what I think made Jesus different than just the scribes that were talking about him.
Okay. Well, I've always thought actions speak louder than words. And so how do you think actions preach louder than words?
You see, I think that was the other great thing about Jesus. Jesus didn't just speak from his relationship with God, he walked the talk. I mean, Jesus said, feed the hungry. And then what did he go and do? He fed the hungry. Jesus says, there's no greater love than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. And then what did Jesus do? He laid down his life for us. Jesus walked the talk. He didn't just talk about God. He lived in a relationship with God and expressed that relationship through the life that he lived.
Okay. Do you have anything you want to ask me? I've been asking you questions all morning.
Which is very interesting now that I'm thinking about it. And so I'm so glad you asked me that question because you see, besides Mark being our administrator and our worship pastor, many of you might not know he's a card-carrying preacher. In fact, when he travels, he's invited to go to preach when he travels. So he's invited to actually go in and preach. And so the question that I have for you, Mr. Mark, is what kind of preacher are you?
Okay. All right. Well, it's a good question. Preaching is one thing when you're up in front of people and telling stories about your life or whatever it is to be relatable to people. But I've always felt that the best way to preach is how you live. And so my day-to-day is more about music and administration than actual preaching, unlike Father Jim. But I have the ability and the opportunity to preach every day, just as all of you do, just by how I live and how people can observe me as a Christian. And so I feel like that is preaching on a day-to-day basis, and not just for me anyway, on the occasional, like you mentioned, somebody invites me to go preach somewhere. So that's what I'd like to say about that.
And so, and it's kind of interesting since you've kind of created this moment, it gives me an opportunity to say that you're one of the preachers who inspires me. Inspires me. What many of you may not know is besides being our administrator and worship pastor, he's also a chaplain with the first responders. He volunteers at that. That means he's on call, and he's sometimes called out in the middle of the night, in the early morning. And we're talking, these aren't easy calls. They typically call him as a chaplain, but it's something like a family member has found someone dead by suicide or other tragic means. And that's the type of preaching Mark does. He brings his relationship with the Lord into those moments. and doesn't just minister to the family, but also to the first responders. Because do you know what it's like being a first responder and having to go into those situations day after day after day? So it's so wonderful that, Mark, you inspire me with what you do here and what you do in your regular life. And it really makes me want to ask all of you, what kind of preachers are you? What sermon is your life giving? What are people hearing loud and clear when they observe you? Because the reality is, there's a lot of sermons going on in the world right now. Are they all inspiring? Are the lives of everyone we see inspiring? Or are they like from that first reading from Deuteronomy we heard today? They're mainly false prophets by what they're witnessing. We're called to be prophets of the Lord, to bring the Lord to the world through our sermons, through our preaching, which is through our actions and our lives. May the Lord be in us, in our hearts, in a relationship with us, and may we bring that relationship to everyone that we meet. As we continually ask ourselves, like I asked Mark, what kind of preacher are you?